In the dimly lit castles of Europe, where stone corridors echoed with whispers of treachery, and in the dusty marketplaces of the Middle East, where justice was dispensed with merciless precision, one sound carried with it the weight of fear and finality, the swish of steel through the air. Beheading, the execution of choice for nobles and rebels alike, was not simply a punishment, it was a ritual, a grim theatre in which power, honour and brutality met in one decisive stroke. To modern sensibilities, the severing of a head may seem grotesque, a nightmare relegated to the darker recesses of history. Yet, during the Middle Ages, it was not only common, but also considered a fate both dreaded and paradoxically desirable. For nobles and knights, death by the sword was seen as an end befitting their station, far more honourable than the noose of a commoner or the flames that consumed heretics. The 14th-century French chronicler Jean Froissart declared, "The sword is the emblem of chivalry, and to perish by it is the noblest of deaths." In this view, the stroke of a blade promised dignity in death, a swift transition from life to eternity, unmarred by the prolonged tortures reserved for those of lower birth. But history tells us a different story, one steeped in irony, where honour was often betrayed by incompetence, and mercy promised by the blade was frequently lost to human error. The tradition of beheading stretched back centuries before the medieval era. The Persians, under King Xerxes I, wielded it as a weapon of terror, cutting down not only enemies, but also desecrating corpses in acts of symbolic vengeance. The Romans codified it under law, decollatio, a form of execution reserved for citizens, a privilege denied to slaves who suffered crucifixion instead. In 485 BCE, Spurius Cassius, accused of conspiring to establish a tyranny in Rome, was decapitated before the people he sought to rule. For the Romans, the axe and sword were both punishment and spectacle, tools through which the Republic announced its supremacy. By the medieval period, the ritual had become entrenched. From the 8th century onward, Europe's kings, queens and knights faced the axe when fate and politics turned against them. William Wallace, the Scottish hero who defied English rule, met his end not simply at the block, but through the added horrors of hanging, drawing and quartering, his head displayed on London Bridge as a warning to those who dreamed of rebellion. Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated wife of Henry VIII, met her death in 1536 at the hands of a skilled French swordsman who, with a single stroke, silenced her defiant grace. Her brother, George Boleyn, was dispatched days earlier, his blood staining the same tower that had once echoed with their laughter. In the East, the sword of Saladin became a legend. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, the great Muslim general personally struck down Raynald de Chatillon, the Crusader prince whose cruelty had earned him infamy. Muslim chroniclers noted how Saladin, calm and deliberate, wielded his blade not only as executioner, but as judge, sending Raynald's severed head to the caliph in Baghdad as a grim token of victory. Yet what was seen as a clean death was often anything but. Skilled executioners were rare, and even among them mistakes were frequent. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, aged 67, endured 11 savage blows before her head was finally severed in 1541. Chroniclers wrote that she refused to kneel, forcing the executioner to hack at her as she stood defiantly on the scaffold. Such moments stripped the act of any honour, reducing it instead to a drawn-out butchery. Still, to die by the sword remained, in the imagination of the Middle Ages, the closest thing to mercy that the brutal world of punishment could provide. As the English historian John Stowe observed, the death of the beheaded is sudden, his anguish short, and his torment swiftly spent. But even this belief was shadowed by the grim reality that executioners were not always men of skill nor mercy, but often men of desperation or corruption. Criminals themselves spared from the gallows in exchange for carrying out the bloody work of kings. And so, beneath banners of kings and the chants of priests, the ritual of beheading became not just a method of execution, but a symbol of honor for the few, of fear for the many, and of power for the rulers who wielded it. Heads will roll, the doomed nobility who met the executioner's sword. Beneath the gleam of sharpened steel and the looming shadow of the executioner's block, countless nobles met their end, their names forever etched in the chronicles of blood and betrayal. For them, beheading was not simply a punishment, but a political theatre, an act staged before the eyes of nations, where power, faith, and defiance were all tested in the space of a heartbeat. Few tales capture this cruel paradox more vividly than that of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII of England. Once the dazzling centre of the Tudor court, she had risen to queenship by capturing the heart of a king and forever altering the course of England's faith by fueling the break with Rome. But her triumph was short-lived. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London in May 1536. Despite pleading her innocence, her fate was sealed. On the morning of May 19th, she was led to a scaffold specially erected within the Tower grounds. Before a hushed crowd, Anne delivered her final words with remarkable composure. "I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." Kneeling in graceful surrender, she placed her fate in the hands of a French executioner renowned for his swiftness. With a single stroke of the sword, her life ended. Yet her legacy as both victim and catalyst of reformation lived on. Her courage was echoed by others who faced the axe with grim acceptance. Sir Thomas More, once Henry VIII's trusted advisor, refused to acknowledge the king as head of the Church of England. Imprisoned and condemned for treason, he too mounted the scaffold in 1535. But where others trembled, More sought solace in wit. Turning to the lieutenant at his side, he jested, "See me safe up. For my coming down, I can shift for myself." As he laid his head on the block, he uttered the words that would echo through centuries. "I die the king's faithful servant, but God's first." His defiance transformed his death into martyrdom, a blow not just to his body, but to the conscience of Europe. The guillotine of revolutionary France later echoed this grim pattern of noble deaths. On January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was led to the Place de la Révolution. Before thousands, drums drowned his voice as he attempted to proclaim his innocence. In moments, his head fell into the basket, an execution not merely of a man, but of monarchy itself. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed 9 months later. Reviled as the symbol of extravagance and corruption, she too faced the blade. Even in her final moments, her manners endured. When she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, she turned to him and whispered, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." Moments later, the guillotine silenced her forever. These were not isolated tragedies, but part of a relentless procession. Lady Jane Grey, remembered as the 9 Days Queen, was only 16 when she mounted the scaffold in 1554. Crowned briefly by political scheming, she became a victim of it when Mary Tudor claimed the throne. Trembling, she declared, "I do wash my hands thereof in innocency." Blindfolded, she struggled to find the block, her young voice breaking the silence of the square before the axe fell. Nor were these fates confined to England and France. Across Europe, noble blood was shed in the name of loyalty, betrayal, and shifting tides of power. The Duke of Montmorency, executed in France in 1632, knelt before the sword of justice. In Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, long a prisoner of her cousin Elizabeth I, met her end with defiance in 1587, dressed in crimson to mark herself a Catholic martyr. Even the executioner trembled, requiring 3 strikes before her head was severed, her courage outlasting his skill. Through these stories runs a common thread. The scaffold was not merely a place of death, but of performance. Final speeches became weapons, last words immortalized as defiance against kings and councils. In their deaths, these nobles revealed both the fragility of power and the enduring dignity of the human spirit. Sir Walter Raleigh, who himself met the axe in 1618, summed up the paradox of noble beheadings when he told his executioner while stroking his beard, "Let not this suffer, for it hath committed no treason." In humour and in horror, in courage and in despair, the condemned transformed the executioner's block into a stage upon which history itself bore witness. The executioner's toolkit, blades, axes, and the grim devices of death. If death by beheading was a ritual, then the executioner's tools were its sacred instruments, objects forged not for battle or glory, but for the precise and terrible art of ending life. In the medieval world, where symbolism clung to every act of power, the weapons of the executioner carried meanings far beyond their steel edges. They were not merely blades, but embodiments of justice, authority, and fear. Foremost among these was the sword of execution. Unlike the slimmer blades used in duels or the elegant weapons carried by knights in combat, execution swords were forged with grim practicality. They were long, heavy, and broad, built to sever with one blow. Some stretched over 5 feet in length, their weight ensuring momentum enough to cleave flesh and bone in an instant. To die by the sword was considered an honor reserved for nobles and warriors, a symbolic recognition of status even in death. The Tower of London kept such swords for centuries, their hilts polished not by combat but by ceremony, their edges sharpened for grim duties. The axe, on the other hand, was a tool of brute force. In England, it became synonymous with treason. Unlike the clean sweep of a sword, the axe demanded precision and strength, and when wielded by an unsteady or unskilled hand, it often led to horrific scenes. Accounts abound of botched executions where the condemned suffered multiple blows, their agony prolonged before death finally came. Yet for all its flaws, the axe became an iconic image of justice, its massive blade gleaming on the scaffold before crowds who came to witness both punishment and spectacle. But medieval Europe did not rely on swords and axes alone. Ingenious and often monstrous devices were invented to mechanize the act of decapitation. In Scotland, the maiden emerged in the 16th century, a wooden frame with a suspended blade that fell with deadly certainty when released. In the English town of Halifax, a similar contraption known as the Halifax gibbet was used for centuries, its diagonal blade crashing down on thieves and traitors alike. These machines foreshadowed the guillotine, which later came to define revolutionary justice in France. The craftsmanship behind these tools was itself a dark art. Execution swords were often forged by master smiths, their steel quenched and polished as finely as any knight's weapon. Some bore inscriptions or designs, not of valor, but of inevitability. To hold such a blade was to hold both prestige and dread, an object designed not for victory but for certainty. The executioner's axe too was meticulously crafted, with a wide crescent blade to maximize its cutting surface. Many were kept sharp with stones between executions, their edges honed not for honor but for efficiency. Yet for all the care taken in their forging, the success of these weapons lay not in the metal, but in the man who wielded them. The executioner himself was a figure of paradox. Both feared and needed, he was often shunned in daily life, relegated to the fringes of society, yet called to center stage when justice demanded blood. In France, dynasties of executioners, such as the Sansons, passed down the role from father to son, honing their skills as a grim family trade. Charles-Henri Sanson, who presided over the deaths of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, wrote with chilling professionalism, "It is not enough to cut off a head. It must be done with skill, in one blow, with certainty." Some executioners earned respect, even privilege, for their work, receiving pensions or property in gratitude for faithful service. Others became infamous for their cruelty or incompetence. England's Jack Ketch, notorious in the 17th century, was reviled for his repeated botched executions, his name becoming synonymous with clumsy brutality. Still, the role persisted, a reminder that in the medieval system of justice, Someone had to stand between the pronouncement of guilt and the finality of death. For those who faced the scaffold, the gleam of these tools was their last vision of life. A polished sword raised high, an axe glinting in the sun, the creak of wood as a maiden's blade was released, all signaled the swift crossing from the world of the living into silence. The executioner's toolkit was not merely a collection of weapons, but a theatre of mortality, where every instrument played its part in society's most macabre performance. As the poet Robert Southwell once wrote, "The executioner's art is to make death a pleasure." In reality, it was seldom merciful, seldom swift, and never divorced from the shadow of fear. The blade, the axe, the device, all carried with them the weight of judgment, the will of kings, and the inevitability of mortality. From courtroom to chopping block, justice and vengeance in medieval trials. In the dim courts of medieval Europe, where candles flickered against wooden beams and judges sat in solemn judgment, the fate of countless souls was decided long before the blade ever met their neck. For those accused of treason, heresy, or crimes against the crown, the courtroom was but the first act in a dark play that ended at the executioner's block. The trial itself was often less a search for truth than a demonstration of power, law wielded as an instrument of control rather than justice. The charges that could lead to beheading were varied, but they all carried the same bitter truth. To oppose the monarch, the church, or the established order was to risk one's head. In England, the crime of high treason, plotting against the king, conspiring with foreign enemies, or even uttering words that could be construed as treacherous, was among the most serious. In 1388, under King Richard II, the Lords Appellant, once powerful noblemen, were condemned for plotting rebellion. One by one they were led from the courtroom to the block, their titles stripped, their blood staining the scaffold. The procedures of medieval justice often made a mockery of fairness. Evidence was sparse, testimony tainted by fear, and confessions wrenched from broken bodies under the lash of torture. Inquisition chambers echoed with screams as the rack stretched limbs or the thumbscrew crushed bones. A confession gained in agony was paraded as truth, and the condemned, weary and shattered, stumbled into court already defeated. The fate of the Knights Templar stands as a chilling example. Accused of heresy in the early 14th century, many confessed to wild charges under brutal torment, their supposed admissions sealing their deaths. Even for those who sought to argue their innocence, the outcome was often predetermined. Kings and queens did not summon trials to weigh justice, but to sanctify vengeance. When Sir Thomas More refused to acknowledge Henry VIII as head of the church, his conviction was inevitable, the trial a mere formality. Likewise, when Mary, Queen of Scots, was accused of plotting Elizabeth's death, the verdict was sealed before her defense could ever sway the court. She declared defiantly, "In my end is my beginning." Those words, spoken before her judges, became her epitaph. Once the sentence was delivered, the condemned were paraded to the site of execution, a ritual of humiliation designed to strip them of dignity. Some were carted through crowded streets, jeered by mobs eager for spectacle. Others were led in solemn procession, priests walking beside them, murmuring last rites. The scaffold awaited, often erected in public squares where thousands could gather. For rulers, the act was never private. It was theatre, justice staged before the eyes of their subjects. On rare occasions, the condemned resisted the ritual. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, condemned at the age of 67, refused to kneel, declaring, "So should traitors do, and I am none." Her defiance unnerved the executioner, who struck wildly until her body collapsed under repeated blows. Such moments laid bare the fragility of the spectacle. A system that demanded obedience could unravel in the face of courage. The figure who stood at the heart of this grim ritual, the executioner, embodied both the certainty and cruelty of medieval justice. Though despised in daily life, shunned as a pariah, he was essential in this final stage of law. Some approached their work with chilling professionalism, aiming for a single clean blow. Others faltered, their nerves or incompetence turning the act into prolonged butchery. The condemned, who prayed for swiftness, often found only horror. Yet even executioners felt the weight of their duty. Charles-Henri Sanson, who carried out the deaths of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, later wrote, "It is not enough to strike. One must strike without hesitation, for the blade wavers when the hand trembles." In his words lies the paradox of his craft, a job meant to ensure the certainty of justice, yet haunted by the humanity of the man who wielded the blade. And so, the path from courtroom to chopping block was never simply about law. It was about spectacle, power, and fear. The condemned were not merely judged, they were displayed. Their deaths served as warnings, their suffering as examples. Justice in the medieval world was not blind but brutal, its scales tipped by politics, vengeance, and the insatiable hunger of rulers to maintain control. As the jurist Sir Edward Coke declared in the 17th century, the life of the law is not logic, but experience. And in the Middle Ages, experience meant that once accused of treason or heresy, the journey from courtroom to scaffold was less a question of guilt than of how swiftly the blade would fall.
The executioner's folly when beheadings turned into botched nightmares. Though beheading was lauded as a swift and merciful death, the grim truth was far less merciful. The clean severing of a head with one decisive stroke required precision, strength, and skill, qualities not every executioner possessed. When the hand faltered or the blade dulled, the scaffold became a place of horror, where dignity dissolved into carnage and mercy into mockery. One of the most infamous examples of execution gone wrong was the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. After nearly 2 decades imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth I, Mary was brought to the block at Fotheringhay Castle, dressed in crimson to signify Catholic martyrdom. Kneeling before the crowd, she uttered her last prayer, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." But the executioner, either nervous or drunk, failed her. The first strike struck the back of her head, not her neck. The second blow cut deeply but did not sever. Only on the third attempt was her head finally taken. To the horror of those assembled, when the executioner held her head aloft, her wig slipped free, revealing hair turned white from years of captivity. Her dignity endured, but her death was anything but merciful. Equally gruesome was the fate of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, executed in 1541. At 67 years old, she refused to submit meekly, declaring, "Blessed be God, though the king takes my head, he shall not have my heart." The young and inexperienced executioner, unsteady in his task, struck at her again and again, forcing her to stumble about the scaffold while he hacked wildly. Chroniclers record that it took 11 blows to kill her. What was meant to be justice became butchery, an act so shocking that even hardened witnesses were appalled. The tragedy of botched executions was not reserved for queens and countesses. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, once the favourite of Elizabeth I, fell from grace after leading a failed rebellion. In 1601, he mounted the scaffold to meet his fate. But his executioner's blows were clumsy and uncertain. It took 3 strikes before Essex's head finally rolled, and even then the crowd recoiled in horror at the drawn-out spectacle. Queen Elizabeth, upon hearing of the bungled act, was said to have wept in anguish, torn between her personal loss and her royal duty. Nor were such horrors confined to nobles. In 1540, under Henry VIII, more than 50 prisoners were executed in London in a single day. The executioners, pressed for speed and lacking skill, hacked at necks with dull axes and blunt swords. The scene, according to one witness, was a very bloody day, and many a poor soul lost his head not in one stroke but in agony of several. Even the hardened spectators, accustomed to public deaths, shuddered and turned away. In Germany, the executioner Franz Schmidt, who served for over 40 years in Nuremberg, kept meticulous records of his executions. Unlike the infamous Jack Ketch of England, Schmidt prided himself on efficiency. Yet even he noted that poor training among lesser executioners led to horrors unimaginable. Botched strikes, severed jaws, heads half attached, victims crying out between blows. The role required practice, and without it, death became not swift, but torturous. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of botched executions was the crowd's reaction. These spectacles, designed to display the authority of kings and the finality of justice, often ended in chaos when the act was clumsy. Gasps, screams, and even riots could erupt as witnesses saw noble dignity reduced to animal slaughter. In 1685, during the execution of the Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of Charles II, the famed English executioner Jack Ketch delivered multiple failed blows, turning the scaffold into a scene of terror. Monmouth reportedly whispered through the blood, "You must finish it." But it took Ketch several agonizing attempts before the Duke's suffering ended. The crowd, horrified, nearly tore the executioner apart. And yet, for all the brutality of these moments, medieval society persisted in its belief that beheading was merciful. The irony was bitter. The most honorable death was also the most vulnerable to human failure. A dull axe, a trembling hand, or a drunken swing could transform mercy into horror in a heartbeat. As one Elizabethan writer bitterly observed, "It is a physician's cure that often kills." The executioner's folly was the condemned's agony, and in those moments the promise of swift release dissolved into the cruelest of betrayals. The theatre of death, how public beheadings became a spectacle of power. On market days and feast days, when peasants gathered to trade grain and nobles paraded through city squares, another kind of gathering often stole the attention of the medieval crowd: the public execution. Among the many punishments staged beneath open skies, none carried the same blend of horror and fascination as the beheading. It was more than a punishment. It was theatre, a carefully choreographed ritual meant to teach obedience through fear, to remind all present that the crown's justice was both swift and absolute. The condemned were not ushered quietly into death, they were paraded. From the courtroom to the scaffold, the journey itself was a procession of shame. Bells rang to summon the people, criers announced the crime. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of pity, rage, and anticipation. For the condemned, each step toward the block was both humiliation and performance, their words and gestures remembered long after their heads had fallen. No execution better revealed the spectacle of power than that of William Wallace in 1305. Captured after years of defying English rule in Scotland, Wallace was dragged through the streets of London on a wooden hurdle, jeered and spat upon by the mob. At Smithfield, his punishment reached its crescendo: hanged, cut down alive, disemboweled, and finally beheaded. His head was mounted on London Bridge, his limbs sent to the four corners of the kingdom as a warning to all who might dream of rebellion. His death was not just a punishment, it was a declaration, a performance of royal authority designed to echo across generations. The ritual of the scaffold was rich with symbolism. In England, a town crier often read the condemned's crimes aloud before the blade fell, ensuring the people understood why blood was being spilled. In France, the condemned were escorted by priests, their prayers mingling with the jeers of the crowd. Sometimes the executioner himself participated in the theatre, kneeling before the victim to ask forgiveness before striking. These gestures did not soften the act, they heightened it, turning death into a spectacle layered with ritual and meaning. When King Charles I of England mounted the scaffold in 1649, the crowd of 20,000 hushed as he addressed them. Calm and composed, he declared his innocence, speaking of his faith and of his belief in divine kingship. Then, kneeling before the block, he uttered his final words, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown." The axe fell, and with it the monarchy itself. The crowd gasped, not merely at the death of a king, but at the transformation of England's order. His execution was not an end, but a performance that reshaped history. The audience at these events experienced a swirl of emotions: fascination, horror, even elation. Some fainted at the sight of blood, others clamored for a better view. Chroniclers describe crowds so vast that people climbed rooftops or trees to glimpse the condemned. In 1571, when the French noblewoman Anne du Bourg was executed in Paris, nearly 100,000 spectators gathered, so many that scaffolding had to be erected for the crowd itself. When the blade fell, gasps rolled through the square like a wave. These public spectacles left deep impressions. Children who watched from their parents' arms carried the images for life. Adults debated the justice or injustice of what they had seen. The scaffold was as much a stage of politics as of punishment, a place where rebels delivered defiant speeches, martyrs proclaimed their innocence, and rulers displayed their strength. Algernon Sidney, executed for treason in 1683, declared at the block, "I die for liberty, for virtue, and for my principles." In such moments, death became not submission, but resistance, transforming execution into a rallying cry. For the rulers, this theatre was essential. A beheading behind closed doors could not serve as a warning. It was the public nature of the act that gave it power. By turning punishment into performance, kings and councils ensured that fear spread far beyond the condemned. Every severed head raised aloft was not just an end, but a message: loyalty or death, obedience or ruin. And yet, within the spectacle, moments of humanity sometimes surfaced. Sir Walter Raleigh, preparing for his execution in 1618, asked to see the axe. Running his hand along its edge, he remarked, "This is a sharp medicine, but it is a physician for all diseases." The crowd, hushed, heard in his words not fear but acceptance, even wit. His courage lingered long after his head was struck from his shoulders. In the end, the scaffold was as much for the living as for the dying. The condemned played their roles, the executioner performed his grim duty, and the crowd absorbed the lesson. Power was absolute, and defiance carried only one conclusion. The beheading was not simply a method of death. It was a ritual, a performance, and a story etched into the memory of all who watched. The fading blade, the decline of beheading, and the rise of new justice. For centuries, the flash of steel and the thud of a severed head upon straw defined justice in the medieval and early modern world. But as the centuries turned, so too did the conscience of society. What had once been seen as swift and merciful came to be regarded as barbaric, a relic of a darker age where cruelty and spectacle were confused with order and law. The blade that had ruled so long began its slow retreat into history. The Enlightenment of the 18th century ushered in a tide of new thought. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, in his On Crimes and Punishments, condemned executions as cruel and counterproductive. He argued that the death penalty brutalized society, teaching cruelty rather than preventing it. The French reformer Jeremy Bentham added his voice, calling for rational, humane systems of justice that did not rely on blood. The shift was philosophical, but also deeply human. For the first time in centuries, lawmakers began to question whether the state had the right to kill at all. Ironically, it was in France, the land that had perfected the public theatre of execution, that the most infamous machine of beheading was born, the guillotine. Conceived as a more egalitarian and efficient instrument, the guillotine's heavy-angled blade promised a quick and equal death, sparing all classes the indignities of the axe. Camille Desmoulins, revolutionary journalist, called it the law made visible, the law made inevitable. But its efficiency also magnified the scale of slaughter. During the French Revolution's reign of terror, the guillotine became the symbol of the state, its blade claiming thousands, from Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to the very revolutionaries who had championed it. The humane machine became the grim drumbeat of mass execution. Yet even as the guillotine carried out its work, public opinion was shifting. In England, the last public beheading took place in 1820 with the execution of the Cato Street conspirators. Over 100,000 people gathered, but many recoiled in disgust. Witnesses wrote of the sea of human faces, all turned toward the scaffold, but also of the horror and revulsion that swept through the crowd as the axe fell. What had once drawn fascination now inspired shame. By the mid-19th century, the tide was unstoppable. Writers like Victor Hugo condemned executions with passionate clarity. His novel, The Last Day of a Condemned Man, 1829, forced readers to imagine the torment of waiting for the blade, the cruel certainty of the guillotine's fall. In speeches before the French Assembly, Hugo thundered, "What we need is not blood, but light, not death, but education." Slowly, the scaffold that had once been a symbol of state authority became a mark of its brutality. The decline of beheading was not swift, but inevitable. The Netherlands abolished capital punishment in 1870, Portugal in 1867, Italy in 1889. In Britain, executions moved behind prison walls, hidden from public view. The guillotine itself lingered in France until 1977, when Hamida Jandoubi became the last man executed by its blade. 4 years later, in 1981, France abolished the death penalty altogether, finally closing the chapter on centuries of blood spilled beneath its steel. Elsewhere, echoes of the past remained. Germany used the guillotine well into the 1940s, its blade falling upon both criminals and political prisoners under the Nazi regime. In the Middle East, where ancient traditions endured, beheading persisted into the modern era. But in Western society, the blade had fallen silent, relegated to museums, history books, and the dark memory of what once was considered justice. The legacy of beheading is paradoxical. It was hailed as merciful, yet often delivered agony. It was meant to uphold order, yet inspired horror. It was performed in the name of kings and councils, yet remembered in the last words of those who defied them. From Anne Boleyn's quiet grace to Mary Stuart's crimson martyrdom, from Charles I's stoic speech to Sir Walter Raleigh's sharp wit, the scaffold became not just a place of death, but a stage for humanity at its most fragile and defiant. Today, the axe and sword lie in glass cases, their edges dulled, their menace gone. But the stories remain. They remind us of a world where justice was spectacle, where death was performance, and where power was written not in laws, but in blood. As Mark Twain once reflected, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The rhymes of beheading echo still, not in the blade's fall, but in the questions it leaves behind. What is justice? What is mercy? And how far will societies go in the name of order before cruelty consumes them? And so the blade, once feared and revered, fades into silence, not forgotten, but remembered as warning. A relic of an age when the worst way to die was also the most honored, when heads rolled not only for crimes, but for the ambitions, betrayals, and beliefs that shaped the course of history.